Well, we see again this morning that Jesus is in conflict with the Pharisees. Now, there has been a tendency in church history to want to beat up on Jewish people, on Judaism, because of some of these stories, how they picture the Pharisees being, so wrong and so in a negative light, which is not actually very helpful. What's helpful to realise is that in these stories, the Pharisees are really representing a religious typology. They're a caricature, if you like. And in a lot of these stories through Mark's Gospel, what's happening is that Jesus is representing the good news, which is versus a rigid way of understanding religion that is not contained just within Judaism, but in fact is a fault that exists in probably every religion. But certainly it's an issue for us. It's not just because they were Jewish that Jesus was highlighting their deficiencies. It's a deficiency that exists in all our hearts. Jesus' dramatic beginning to his ministry, in Mark's Gospel anyhow, starts off with a series of these miraculous healings. And the Pharisees get angrier and angrier over a series of offences. First of all, it's his intimacy with the tax collectors and other general sinners. It's his indifference to fasting. And now in this particular scene, we see that it's a question of observing the Sabbath. By the end of this story, they are so angry and upset they are seeking allies who would help them kill him. In all of these passages, they're really rich in their meaning and in their symbols, which you could spend ages and ages just looking at at all of those details. But one thing stands out in the way that Mark presents these two forms of piety, if you like. And it's the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees that is one that lives in us. The Pharisees, you see, represent the basic temptation to absolutise all of those things that mediate faith to us, the vehicles of our faith, and to raise them up as if they are the be-all and end-all, because they bring us into faith, and they give our faith significance, that we might then take those things and elevate them to a place that they were never supposed to be. Things like forgiveness, conventions about what and when and with whom we eat, honouring the Sabbath. Now we might think, those are all very Jewish kind of things, but they're also very much a part of our Christian heritage. We rely so heavily on our understanding of forgiveness of sins. All around food and who we spend time with, who we eat with, and how we do it. Now, we have a slightly different time reference for what we would call the Sabbath, but we have the same notion. And all of these things are about the way that we sanctify time and space, the way that we make holy time and space, that they would then encourage and nurture and feed our faith. And over centuries, over generations, we have these traditions that nurture our faith. They become for us a part of living this Christian life. And our commitment to those things comes from the way that we read Scripture. We find that they are there in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and that's why we value them. That's why we say we live this way, we do these Christian things that give us faith and bring meaning, but we do them because they're there in Scripture. So in contrast to living Judaism, these Pharisees are portrayed as being obsessed with religious authority, with specific observances, and with righteousness. They are apparently immune to Jesus' healing power, to his charisma that draws people to him. They're immune to his intimacy with outcasts and those on the edges of society. And they're enraged by his indifference to those religious customs. Their love of Scripture and tradition makes them blind to the compassion and joy that is pouring out of Jesus to the people around him, toward all humanity. And they can't see it because they're so in love with Scripture, so in love with their ways of doing things, their ways of being faithful and holy. But in defence of the Pharisees, I don't know if you noticed, as we read through that, if you really thought about the arguments at play there and what Jesus says in his responses, but if you look at them closely, you'll notice that Jesus seems to be deliberately provoking them to a confrontation. Maybe you sort of glossed over it. We're so used to putting Jesus as always being in the right and the pure sort of position, and the Pharisees are always playing the role of the baddie in this little drama, that we don't notice when Jesus is actually niggling them, and deliberately so. See, the story is not about how urgent need allows us to, or permits us to, break the rules. It's not that, is it? I mean, Jesus actually brings out this story of David, who was with his men. You remember the story, or maybe you don't. They were starving. They had no food to eat, and they were on the run. So they charge into the temple and they grab the sacrificial bread that's there in the sort of the foyer area. Before you get to the Holy of Holies, there's the bread that's laid out to represent the manna that God fed his people with, the 12 tribes. And so they would have 12 loaves of bread. And there David comes along with his 12 cohort, and they go, "Well, there's a loaf for everyone. Fantastic." So Jesus referenced that because they were starving, and it allowed them to eat what they should not have been touching. And so Jesus says, well, if it was good enough for David, are you really going to have a go at me for doing something King David did, when we all know that the Messiah is going to be one of his descendants? So if I'm doing what David did, surely that's okay. The only thing is, if you back that up a little bit, you go, hang on, David and his mates were starving. They were dying without food. Your disciples just aimlessly wandering through a field, picking grains of wheat, and, like they couldn't find the beer nuts somewhere. Oh, we'll just have that. They're not starving. Those two things are actually completely different. The response of the Pharisees surely is anger, because they're going, that's not the same. You guys are just being lazy. You guys are just working on the Sabbath, not because you were starving, just because you weren't observing it. You weren't being faithful and cautious and doing what everyone else does. I mean, everybody else cooks up their meals on the Friday night so that they do no cooking on Saturday. They make sure everything is done well in advance. They even have special cooking gear so that things are kept hot and kept wonderful. A special urn so they don't have to boil the kettle, so that on the Sabbath you can just have your tea and coffee. That's nowadays I'm talking. That's how they get around it. And they did in those days as well. So Jesus' disciples are just flagrantly disobeying this understanding of the Sabbath and keeping it holy. The man with the shriveled hand, well, it was great to heal him, but they could have waited till sundown and healed him then. How long has he been like this? Is this life or death scenario? No. So we can't really say that Jesus here is, and his words are, is it right to give life, to save life on the Sabbath, or to take life? Well, that's not actually what's happening here. A, he's not saving somebody from death, and B, the alternative was just the Sabbath. It was just keeping it holy. It was not, in fact, was this man going to die if he didn't get healed before sundown? And you see, their anger is not that he's doing these things in an emergency, that he's breaking the rules for really good and important reasons, because that's too easy. The Jewish people had always understood that the rules were to be kept if you could, as best you could, wherever you were. But if you couldn't keep those rules, well, it's like, poor you. If you can't keep the rules, that's your loss. And certainly if it was an emergency, nobody was upset about that. But Jesus rather is inviting us to a terrifying form of faith in which our time-honoured traditions are relativised by healing and by compassion and by joy. That is, the things that we hold dear, that we do religiously because they've always transferred faith for us. They've always been a vehicle of faith. Those things to which we hold dear, he's saying they're really put in their place. They're really put down the order because of healing and compassion and joy. The implication of this story is that normal religious commitments and practices can render us indifferent to human suffering and building true community. Isn't that a scary thought, that we get so used to doing things the way we do them, that like the Pharisees, we might become blind to human suffering and the ways that we could build true community. Maybe you don't find it so, but I find that a little confronting and a little scary. That Jesus is breaking these rules not because they were bad rules, but because the Pharisees here were so in love with the rules that they did not see the needs around them. They did not see the human suffering right there in front of them. And that we might be just like that. In the very normal things that we do here on a Sunday morning. For a religion to survive thousands of years, let alone hundreds of years or even generations, you have to create ways of living out your dedication to God. And this story reminds us that there might be a price to pay when those commitments become idolatry. When we cherish the gifts of God, even the Scripture and religious conventions and morality, when we cherish them so much, we might lose the power to cherish the people of God. A little bit like our puppets down here. It's a really difficult lesson to learn that the rules are not as important as people are. And the people of God, is where our heart is supposed to be placed. I was reminded beautifully this week that when Jesus was asked what was the most important rule, he said, love God and love your neighbour. He didn't give them all 316. He said the most important is to love God and to love your neighbour. Jesus is described as being angry and having grief over these Pharisees for their hardness of their hearts. That's what's going on in this passage. But I'm thinking perhaps we should have some pity for them because they're so like us. I wanted to give you a time just to reflect on this concerning passage of Jesus. And so we're going to sing an item. It's a song called Hands. It was written by a girl when she was 18 years old. And she wrote it after an experience where she was working in a computer warehouse, and she was the girl who answered the phones. Well, her boss propositioned her and wanted to take advantage of her, and she didn't welcome his advances, and so he fired her. When she said, "Well, I need to be paid out for," he just completely ignored her, didn't pay her, but didn't even acknowledge that she was there. Wouldn't open the door to her, and didn't pay. She was renting a small place, and she told the landlord what had happened, and the landlord said, "I really feel for you, but I have to get paid for the rent." So he was a little bit generous, but in the end he had to kick her out because she just couldn't pay. She ended up living in her car, and she got to the point where she was stealing food because she just had no money, because she was living in her car and often cold. She got sick and couldn't hold down a job. When she got a little bit of work, then she would seem to get sick and then lose it again. And she was literally just living on the smell of an oily rag. And one day she was passing a shop window and she saw a dress that she just fell in love with and thought, "Oh, I'd so love to have that dress." And because up until then she'd been stealing stuff that she needed, she looked at the dress, but it had only been food. And she looked at the dress and thought, "I really want that dress. I wonder if I could steal something as big as stealing a dress." It was $39. And she was just wondering if this was possible when she sort of came to herself, one of those prodigal moments, and she realised, how bad must I be if I don't think I'm ever going to get $39 that I could buy a dress? How low is my self-esteem and my value of myself and where I think I might go, that I think I'll never get $39 again, that I could own a dress like this. So I would have to steal it. And she made a decision then that she was going to change her life. And so this is the song she wrote about using her hands really to speak up for what's right and to fight for what's important in life. And for her it was a visual thing. She wasn't going to use her hands to steal stuff. She was going to use her hands to do good things, just like in Jesus' story.
not yours, they are my own, and I'm never broken. My hands are small, I know, but they're not yours, they are my own, but they're not yours.